All right, welcome to our last pre-recorded lecture on racism. This is lecture 4.3, and we are finally turning to the paper by Shelby on racism, moralism, and social criticism. So let's get right into it. What are Shelby's goals in this paper? Um, Actually, one preliminary note. I do want you to remember that the piece that we read from Bloom was from 2002. And this piece by Shelby is from 2014. So, these aren't ancient pieces by any means, but they're not super recent, and a lot has happened recently, as you all know. So it's going to be useful for you to think about what's changed in our discussion of racism in the past, couple years, but even in the past 6 months. And just one place where you might notice that this paper was not written this year is that Shelby starts by drawing our attention to the idea that we live in a post-racial society, which he thinks is, at the time when he was writing, something that was often said. And so he wants to pick apart what is meant by this, what the different things that people sometimes mean by this, and so on. But I think that however we do understand this term of this, the idea of a post-racial society, people don't seem to be saying that we live in a post-racial society anymore. So that's one thing that tells you a lot has changed in the past, 5, 8, even 2 years. Okay, so what are Shelby's goals? One important claim that he makes is that we should give political philosophy theoretical primacy over moral philosophy in normative analyses of racism. So what does he really mean by this? Well, he thinks a philosophical account of racism is first and foremost an account of the justice of institutional arrangements. It is not first and foremost about the ethics of individual character and interpersonal conduct. So that's what he means when he says that political philosophy should have primacy over moral philosophy in our theorizing about racism, in our normative theorizing about racism. He also wants to show us that we should understand racism as ideology, and we're going to talk about what that means later. And he is going to criticize some of the things that Bloom says. We're going to talk about this more presently as well. And to clarify one point, Shelby is not saying that we don't need an account of what's objectionable or wrong about individual racism. He's just saying that the political philosophical approach should come first. All right, now the language that Shelby uses to describe the difference between his kind of approach and Bloom's kind of approach is the language of this distinction between a narrow scope and a wide scope conception of racism. So Bloom is the representative of a narrow scope conception of racism. And as you've seen already, this just means that he wants to narrow the scope of what racism refers to and use the term racism only for the most serious moral wrongs. Shelby, on the other hand, wants to argue for a wide scope conception of racism. And this means that he wants to use the term racism to describe all sorts of different phenomena, which include both the most serious moral wrongs and things that may not even be morally wrong at all. So what does Shelby say is wrong with Bloom's narrow scope approach? Well, one problem in his view is that it's not actually better than a wide scope approach at dealing with the conversation stopper problem. So remember, one of the things Bloom was trying to say was that if we narrow the scope of what we mean by racism to refer to the very, very serious wrongs involving antipathy and inferiorization, And then if we have different terms to refer to other kinds of racial ills, it's going to help people be better at talking about racism with one another. People won't have so much anxiety uh, in conversations about race and racism. And Shelby's saying, in fact, the narrow scope account isn't any better in this way. And he thinks that one way of seeing why it's not any better, and he'll talk about another in a bit, is that a person can simply distinguish between holding the private judgment that somebody else is racist and deciding to say that out loud. So you can deal with the conversation stopper by exercising good judgment about when you should vocalize your judgment that somebody is racist. And so, judicial judgments on this count can help you deal with the conversation stopper and continue to have conversations about racism simply by not calling people racist, even if you hold the private judgment that they are indeed racist. And again, we're going to talk about what he means by racist. That's important, but that's a preliminary point. He also thinks that it's important to Bloom's whole approach that people, in fact, think of racism as a very serious moral wrong. So this is an assumption that underlies much of what he says. And Shelby is unconvinced that, in fact, everyone thinks of racism as one of the most serious moral wrongs. He thinks that many people likely want to avoid the appearance of racism for prudential reasons. That means they know it wouldn't be good for them to be seen as a racist, but they don't actually personally think that being racist is a serious wrong. Another piece of evidence he cites is that there are so many people that oppose policies that would, in fact, reduce the incidence of racism and mitigate its effects. And the fact that all these people oppose such policies is some indication that they don't really think racism is a very serious moral wrong. So Shelby is skeptical that this assumption that everybody agrees that racism is one of the more serious moral wrongs is correct. So what does Shelby suggest? Well, he thinks that instead of starting with the assumption that racism is one of the worst moral wrongs, we can do just as well to start with the following set of assumptions, which are friendly to a wide scope account. So racism comes in many forms and manifests itself in numerous ways. All forms and expressions of racism are prima facie cause for moral concern, meaning when you first see them, you should be morally concerned. Not every form of racism is a grave moral failing, and indeed, not every form of or expression of racism represents a moral failing at all. So this is on page 61 if you want to go back and read through it again. And in fact, this is an interesting part of the paper. Shelby says that we should notice that wide scope and narrow scope accounts are functionally equivalent. So what does he mean by this? He means, either we distinguish between more and less serious wrongs within the category of racist phenomena, or we distinguish between more and less serious wrongs by distinguishing between what's properly within the scope of racism, the serious stuff, and what's counted as included in the category of other racial ills, the less serious things. The choice between these two options has no functional difference, Shelby is saying. And what's interesting is that if he's right about this, then, and he makes this point in the paper, really the argument Bloom has for his narrow scope claim is the following. The argument is that the strategy is a better anti-racist response. So if these two options are functionally equivalent, then the only argument Bloom has in his favor is that his strategy has better consequences, which is that it's going to lead to better interracial understanding. And you saw that he did, in fact, argue for his strategy in this way, in part. But Shelby actually doesn't think that Bloom's account is even better at this. Um, so Bloom elaborates his narrow scope approach in a way that starts with an evaluation of individual character and conduct. But Shelby thinks that part of what's wrong with this is that, practically speaking, institutional factors actually have greater significance for people's welfare and life prospects. And the wide scope account is better equipped to handle this. So if we're evaluating the two options now on the basis of which has more important practical consequences, he says, practically speaking, for people that are victims of racism, institutional factors are much more significant than the things pertaining to individual character and conduct. As a kind of side note, Shelby also points out that in trying to understand what racism is, the task of philosophers, in his view, is not necessarily to give an account that is totally in coherence with common sense, that totally agrees with common sense. He says we want an account that leads to the best understanding of racism as we can get. And so this might mean that the account we ultimately land on doesn't correspond to all of the features of common sense, what common sense recommends. Okay, so we need to now answer the question, what's wrong about racism on Shelby's view? And he approaches this question by looking at an important kind of case, which is the case of a racist belief. So what is wrong about a racist belief in Shelby's view? And he has a couple things to say about this. So one problem is that a racist belief includes a false claim. So it's false. And because it is false, it's subject to epistemic criticism. So to take an example, if a person has the racist belief that race X, let's assume that's a race, is not as intelligent as race Y, that would be a false claim, and that would make it subject to epistemic criticism. It's just not an actual knowledge claim. It's not a true knowledge claim. But the second point is that racist beliefs can be used to justify oppression. And Shelby thinks that this is what makes racist beliefs also subject to moral criticism. Note, however, that this leaves room for cases where a person is racist on his understanding because of an epistemic failing, but the person may not be subject to moral criticism. So maybe the person has a false belief about race, a racist belief, maybe that a certain race is less intelligent than another race, and may be subject to epistemic criticism, but in principle, he thinks this person may not be subject to moral criticism. Here's something he says about this. He says, were we to recognize that one can do or say something racist, or make a decision on the basis of racist considerations without being a bad person or acting immorally, a more honest and perhaps less tense interracial dialogue among those of goodwill about problems of race would be possible. Bringing more people around to this realization should be among our anti-racist tasks, not narrowing the scope of racism to only the worst racial wrongs. So this is the other side of Shelby's argument for why the narrow scope approach that Bloom advocated doesn't actually deal with the conversation stopping problem any better than the wide scope approach that he's recommending. All right, but we still have to get to the most important question, which is, what does it mean to say that racism is ideology? So here is what Shelby means by that claim. First, what is ideology? So this is the general definition he gives of ideology. An ideology is a widely held set of loosely associated beliefs and implicit judgments that misrepresent significant social realities and that function through this distortion to bring about or perpetuate unjust social relations. So that's ideology. Now, racism is ideology on his view. What does this mean? He says, racism is a set of misleading beliefs and implicit attitudes about races or race relations whose wide currency serves a hegemonic social function. So let us assume that this thought bubble between these four people somehow could represent um, widespread, loosely associated beliefs and implicit judgments. Okay, then what he's saying is that beliefs and implicit judgments held by all these people that misrepresent the way things are and help to reinforce the subordination of certain racial groups, that's racist ideology. And why does he think that this account of racism as ideology can help us see what's wrong about racism? Well, it falls out pretty naturally. We saw here that it's in the definition of ideology that ideology perpetuates unjust social relations. That's a moral problem. Ideologies perpetuate injustice. A side note is that you may have noticed throughout the paper that Shelby was referring to Bloom's 2002 publication, and we read a paper that Bloom published in 2002 that overlaps with this book that I've put on the slide, which was also published in 2002. But Shelby's criticisms of Bloom on ideology was referring to the book and not to the paper. So if you were wondering where the talk about ideology in fact came up in Bloom, it wasn't in the paper, as you saw. It's in his book. All right, there are a few other features of ideologies that we need to lay out. So one is that Shelby acknowledges that ideologies can change through time. And this is important in part because it means that they don't need to involve an essentialist conception of race. So there can be an ideology that doesn't presume the essentialist conception of race. A very important point is that ideologies are typically attributed not to individuals, but rather to social groups or whole societies or even historical eras. So the thing that has an ideology is not an individual, but rather social groups, whole societies, or historical eras. And it's also important to point out that treating racism as an ideology does not mean that only racist beliefs can count as racist. So you would notice that ideologies are characterized in terms of beliefs and implicit judgments that are loosely associated and widely held. We can characterize racism as an ideology without saying that only beliefs or implicit judgments can be racist. The point is that other forms or expressions of racism need to be explained in terms of the beliefs and judgments that are included in the ideology. So this allows for persons to be racist, actions to be racist, institutions to be racist, societies to be racist. Okay, so one kind of objection one might have is that Shelby's account explains the wrongness of racism by explaining the wrongness of ideologies in general. And he notes that some people might object to this on the grounds that racism is worse than other ideologies. So here's the beginning of his answer, and then we'll state the upshot very directly. He says that what made the monstrous systems of oppression of the past specifically racist and distinguished them from similar but non-racist forms of group dominance, which have also involved exploitation, slavery, segregation, conquest, and genocide, is that the notion of race was invoked in a way that legitimized denying persons the respect and just treatment due them. And this ideological work enhanced the likelihood that the dominant groups hegemony would be successful or continue unabated. His working hypothesis, then, is that whatever makes ideologies in general wrongful is what makes racism wrongful. So he just accepts this consequence. What makes ideologies wrongful is what makes racism wrongful. And what is especially wrong about ideologies is that ideological justifications deny the equal moral standing of the oppressed, and they say that it's justified to do this. And this is why Shelby says that part of what's wrong about ideologies and racism is, in part, it's an expressive harm. So you deny the equal moral standing of somebody who's oppressed, and then you have a set of beliefs that justifies this, says it's okay to do this. And that claim that it's justified is part of the harm. Okay, so to summarize, what's wrong about racist beliefs, according to Shelby, is that they conceal the fact that current social arrangements are unjust, and they do this by rationalizing them. And he says, this is why he says that the content of the beliefs justifies epistemic criticism, and the function of the belief justifies moral criticism. So let me explain this with an example. Let's go back to our racist belief that race X is not as intelligent as race Y. So this claim is false, and this makes the ideology and the belief epistemically criticizable. That's this element. The content of the belief that race X is not as intelligent as race Y is false, and so it's subject to epistemic criticism. But this belief can also be used to rationalize the oppression of members of race X. So it might be used to deny them opportunities in various different kinds of ways. And this makes the ideology morally criticizable. So the function of the belief might be to rationalize and justify oppression, and this is why it is morally criticizable. All right, so let's return now to this question of the individual and society and try to bring things together a bit to close. So overall, Shelby's take is summarized in this last little passage, which refers to Rawls, but don't worry about that part of it if you are not familiar with Rawls. So he says, Rawls rightly insists that the principles of justice should not be confused with the principles we rely on to evaluate the conduct and character of individuals. This is to distinguish personal morality from political morality. Both are relevant to understanding what makes racism wrong and which anti-racist strategies should be pursued. But racial ideology cannot be adequately understood or combated without grasping its role in legitimizing unjust social arrangements. So the upshot here is that on the question of how we should understand the relationship between racism in individuals and racism in societies, Shelby's saying we need to start with political morality and questions about racism in society and in social arrangements. And part of this is his claim that racism is first and foremost ideology. Remember, he says that ideologies belong to social groups, entire societies, and eras. They don't belong to individuals first and foremost. Here's a question I want to leave you with in light of this, and I'm really interested to hear what you think. So do you all think that we are now seeing a kind of awakening in personal morality where we are starting to believe that, in fact, personal morality plays more of a role in determining what happens at the level of society as a whole than we used to think? This is an open question. I'm truly not sure. I think that most of us believe that in structural racism, which might be the more common term for the kinds of things that Shelby is talking about. And then my question is, do you think that we're starting, we, collective we, whatever the sort of discussion is in society now, is starting to think about individual morality as an indispensable tool to changing structural injustice in a way that we didn't think about it before, um, or not. Okay, that is the question I will leave you with, and that question should also gear you towards thinking a little bit about what might be the best strategy for thinking about the relationship between individual racism and racism in society, um, assuming we are already granting that it exists in some way in both places, where I think all of the people we read this week agreed to that. They just differed with respect to where we should be starting in our theorizing. Okay, looking forward to discussion. I will see you later. Oh, I forgot something. So sorry. I wanted to um, note that if you liked Shelby's article, you might want to go look and at his other books. So he has several books, and the most recent one is called Dark Ghettos. And you have now the link to that website there if you did not turn off your video when it looked like I was closing. Sorry about that.